The storm rolled in with a ferocity Claire hadn't expected. Thick grey clouds stretched across the sky, blotting out the sun, and the wind howled through the pines as though warning her to turn back. But she had no choice. The cabin, isolated and half forgotten, was her only option. It had been her grandmother's cabin, tucked deep within the Appalachian woods. After Grandma died 2 months ago, the property had been left to Claire. Everyone in the family had warned her not to bother with the place. "It's too remote," her mother had said. "No one's been there in decades." But when Claire's job and relationship both imploded in the same week, the idea of solitude felt like salvation. By the time she arrived, the storm had turned the dirt road into a slippery, treacherous mess. Her car skidded to a stop just outside the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked exactly as she remembered from her childhood: weathered wood, a slanted roof, and windows staring out like empty eyes. She grabbed her duffel bag and flashlight, bracing herself against the wind as she hurried to the front door. The key, still hidden under the loose plank in the porch, slid easily into the lock. Inside, the air was stale and tinged with mildew. Furniture covered in dust sheets loomed like ghosts in the dim light. Claire exhaled, half relieved, half unsettled. It was just a cabin, 4 walls, a roof, a safe place to weather the storm. After lighting a fire in the stone hearth, she unpacked the essentials: a few cans of food, bottled water, her grandmother's old oil lamp. She had barely settled when the storm intensified, rain lashing the windows in relentless sheets. The cabin groaned and creaked as though resenting her presence. Claire tried to ignore it, distracting herself with a book, but an hour in, something snapped outside, a branch maybe. She froze, listening. The wind howled, but beneath it came a new sound, faint scratching against the cabin wall. Her pulse quickened. Probably just tree branches swaying in the wind, she told herself. Still, she grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window. The beam of light revealed only darkness and rain. Claire clenched the flashlight tightly, debating whether to investigate. After a long moment, she threw on her rain jacket, grabbed this fireplace poker, and stepped out onto the porch. The storm slammed into her, drenching her instantly. She circled the cabin, the flashlight beam jittering with her shaking hand. The noise seemed to come from the far side of the house. There, beneath the window, she found it, long, deep gouges carved into the wooden siding. They were fresh, the wood splintered and raw. Her stomach twisted. What kind of animal could do that? A bear? A cougar? The flashlight flickered, then went out. Claire swore, fumbling with it, but when the light came back on, she was alone. Whatever had made the marks was gone. Back inside, she bolted the door and tried to shake off the unease. The fire crackled warmly, and the storm outside would eventually pass. She reminded herself she was overreacting. This was the wilderness. Animals were normal, but as the hours dragged on, the cabin grew quieter. The wind died down and the rain eased into a soft patter. Yet the silence felt heavy, like a held breath. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, 3 gentle taps on the front door. Claire froze. She glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Who could possibly be out here in this storm at this hour? Another knock, louder this time. She crept to the door, heart hammering. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Claire hesitated, then peeked through the peephole. The porch was empty. The knock came again. This time it was at the back door. Her blood ran cold. There was no way someone could have moved that quickly without her seeing. She grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it like a lifeline, and backed away from the door. The knock repeated, this time against the window beside her. Claire whipped around, but all she saw was her own pale reflection in the glass. "Who's out there?" she shouted, her voice breaking. The cabin answered with silence. Then she heard it. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. "Claire." Her breath hitched. "Who are you?" No response. Only the whisper of her name again, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She stumbled back, panic flooding her veins. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, as though they were watching her. Suddenly the fire in the hearth flared, casting wild, flickering light across the walls, and then it went out. Claire was plunged into darkness. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all murmuring her name. She fumbled for the flashlight, but it was gone. The oil lamp! She staggered to the table where she'd left it, her fingers trembling as she lit the wick. The small flame flickered to life, casting a dim glow. And that's when she saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the lamplight was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Empty black sockets stared at her where eyes should have been, and its mouth, wide and lipless, twisted into a grotesque grin. Claire, it rasped, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. She screamed, dropping the lamp. The flame sputtered and died, plunging her back into darkness. Blindly she stumbled toward the door, but the whispers were everywhere now, the air thick with them. Claire! 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 She clawed at the lock, flinging the door open and sprinting into the storm. The rain drenched her, but she didn't stop. The woods closed in around her, branches tearing at her clothes and skin as she ran. Behind her, she heard it. Heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, gaining on her. She didn't dare look back. Her foot caught on a root and she went down hard, the air knocked from her lungs. Rolling onto her back, she saw it towering over her, its grin wider now, jagged teeth glinting in the storm's lightning. It reached for her with spindly, clawed hands, and she screamed. They found Claire's car the next morning, abandoned at the edge of the clearing. The cabin was empty, the door hanging open, the inside untouched save for a few muddy footprints leading from room to room. Of Claire there was no sign. But the townsfolk whispered about the cabin after that, saying it was cursed, haunted by something ancient that prowled the woods on stormy nights. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, you could hear it, the faint sound of someone calling a name, Claire.